Welcome to CWJah Talk number 16. Today's show is going to be the first part in an ongoing series about pre-Christian evidence that Christian witnesses of Jah believe point to Jesus as the biblical Messiah. Now, by pre-Christian evidence, what I mean and what I'm going to show today as the first part of this series is evidence from biblical texts but that are not Christian, in the sense that they were written by Christians. They are pre-Christian texts that were written by Hebrews or Jews who descended from the tribal system post-Exodus in accordance with the law of Moses, but which also went through various periods of captivity and dispersion. And so the biblical text that we're going to consider today, it was written according to the account by one we know as the prophet Micah, who lived according to the evidence we have in the 8th century and who served under various Israelite kings, Judean kings, such as Hezekiah. So Micah is also referred to by other biblical writers, biblical prophets, well-known biblical prophets like Jeremiah. Jeremiah 26 refers to Micah. And so we have representation for the book that Micah wrote, the things that he wrote about during his 50-plus years of service under these Hebrew kings. And in speaking about the God Jah, we have representation of the book of Micah in actual written texts, datable to anywhere from 50 to 150 BCE, texts that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in the case of Micah, the representation we have that's from 150 or 50 to 150 BCE is in a Greek translation of the Hebrew Aramaic texts as the Jews became more and more familiar with Greek. There's even an account known as the Letter of Aristeas about the preparation of the Greek translation. It was a very official thing done by many respected and well-known scholars from Jerusalem, according to the account, who prepared the Greek version, or at least the first part of the Greek version. Many believe the first 5 books of the Bible were first prepared. But later on, additional books like those of Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah were translated into Greek for Greek-speaking Jews as well. And that's referred to, the Greek translation, that is, in collectively most often as the Septuagint. And you might see it referenced by a capital L and 2 X's, which stand for 70, which is supposed to represent the number of translators, even though that number is disputable. Either way, the Greek translation was authoritative and was even used by the Christians, as well as the Jews, as I'm talking about here in this text, and in the whole process of translating the Hebrew Aramaic biblical texts, like the 5 books of Moses, and then later texts, books of Kings, and prophets like Isaiah, the Psalms, into Greek. So the text of Micah we have is actually a Greek text, and the only exception to the Greek text of Micah is when it comes to the divine name, where it is used in either Paleo-Hebrew or Aramaic characters, not as a surrogate or a representation like Lord or God, or an abbreviation for either of those terms with a line over it. That's not used. That was not used at this time, at least not in this text. So it speaks directly about the God Jehovah and sanctifies his name in that respect in and among the Greek text, as you're going to see in those Hebrew or Aramaic characters. So we have evidence for the book of Micah that we're going to consider that predates Jesus by probably anywhere from 75 to 175 years. But that is a copy of what was originally written 800 years or so before Jesus was born. So Micah, according to all the available evidence and the chronologies that we have of all these different individuals whose books we read, actually lived and wrote during the 8th century. Again, under kings like Hezekiah. And he did so for a period of over 50 years. And is referenced by other biblical writers, like I mentioned, Jeremiah. So this is not someone who's obscure or an irrelevant figure in biblical history. As you're going to see, the things he speaks about and in our view prophesied about came true according to the New Testament accounts about Jesus. But first we want to, before looking at the New Testament accounts, we need to look at the pre-Christian account of Micah and ask ourselves whether or not what it says, well, according to the text datable 75 to 175 years before Jesus was born, I'm going to show you a copy of it, is accurate when we compare it to what we read in the New Testament about Jesus. So let's go ahead and do that. This is the first text we're going to use. We'll talk about other texts as part of later CWJah Talk shows as in relation to this series of pre-Christian evidence. And they're all going to be the same type of evidence. Evidence that we have texts datable, which contain the account that we believe speaks about things that would only occur in fulfillment of the biblical Messiah, and that now no longer can be fulfilled the way they were originally spoken about. So let's take a look at that account. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring up for you a menu we're going to see together. So this is my one of my sites, and if you go to it, the ElihuBooks.com site, you go to the topical index. You could at the front, let me go back to that here. At the front, if you notice here, watching the ministry, this will take you to my blog. And I believe, actually, if you look on the side here, it may be a little more difficult for you to see, but it actually has a link on the side to articles that have been viewed a lot, and there's the Micah 5:2. I was going to show you in my topical index. I'll do that because I think a lot of people aren't familiar still with the topical index and what it contains. It contains quite a bit, and sometimes you have to look through it a little. But if you go down to like in B, Bible, teachings and issues, there's a lot there. So you can see Jesus' real personal preexistence. There's 4 links there. And if you just hover over each one and look down to the lower left, you'll see kind of the title. So the first one, there's the article on Jesus as wisdom and the Word and the evidence that shows that. And then the second one comes up, and it's the Micah 5:1-2 article I wrote, which is going to be a part of what we read today. So let me try to get that so I can show you. There we go. And we're all reading the same thing. And basically in this article, what I did was something similar to what I'm doing in this show. And that is provide the text datable to the time well before Jesus was born, both in terms of when it was originally written and then copied down through the ages to the point where it was officially translated into Greek, either as part of the original Septuagint translation or if done later, still by those who knew both languages well enough and were concerned enough that the Jews who could speak Greek had the text, so that we know that this is a copy of earlier texts because it's translated into Greek with the use of the divine name in the same way that the other biblical texts that are represented also in Hebrew and Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls exist. So the fact that it's translated into Greek, I believe, shows clearly that it had to have come from a Hebrew Aramaic copy because it's a part of the translated text. You see what I'm saying? Whether as part of the original text done by the 70 or 72, however many they were, or some later point, it was translated into Greek. Hence the use of the Paleo-Hebrew Aramaic divine name, which was in the translated text. So even though our earliest text of Micah 5 is datable to between 50 and 150 BCE, it's from a text that's earlier. We know that because it's a translation of the earlier text that still includes the Paleo-Hebrew Aramaic divine name from that earlier text. So the Jews just wouldn't insert that in any old Greek text that was just compiled. You see what I'm saying? And it would have been obvious to those at the time. The Jews were very well organized societies, especially when it came to scribal transmission. That's why their texts are reliable from this period. So keep that in mind. So we have very good representation of this book and all biblical books. But Micah 5, we have texts that are translations of even earlier texts that would have been closer to the time of Hezekiah and other Judean kings during which Micah wrote. So that's good information you should keep in mind whenever this comes up, because we're talking pre-Christian for sure. Both in the Greek translation of the text we're going to read, that's the earliest version, and basically the same as the Hebrew version we have in terms of the content. And then, of course, we know it represents an earlier Hebrew Aramaic text. So let's go down. We're going to look at both. So you'll see why I'm saying they're both basically the same. And as you can see, I'm going to show you both the copy I included in my article here with the transliteration. And then we're going to actually go and look at the actual images right there. It's one. And here's another one. But we'll get to those in a second. And I'll scale them down so you can see the whole thing. So let's get to this text here. This is the text to start off our series in terms of evidence we believe shows that during pre-Christian times, they believed things that were eventually fulfilled in Jesus. Okay, so the text of Micah 5, let's take a look at it. I'll just read briefly both the Hebrew, translation of the Hebrew, and then a translation of the Greek, which I put in my article here on Micah 5. It's at my blog, Watching the Ministry. I wrote this back in 2010. So let's take a look. Micah 5, 1 through 3, a translation of the Hebrew text. And you, Bethlehem, also known as Ephrathah, you who are too small to be among the thousands of Judah, from you will go out he who will rule over Israel, whose origin, or origins, we'll talk about that later, is from the beginning, or from earlier, from ancient times. And let me skip, I don't want to read all the bracketed material and get off the flow of the text. So he, whose origin is from the beginning. We know who that describes in the New Testament, but we'll save it for later. From the days of old. Verse 2, therefore, he will give them up until the time when she finishes laboring and actually gives birth. This is metaphors here. And then the remaining ones of his brothers will return to the sons of Israel. Verse 3, that is when he will stand and shepherd with Jah's strength in the majesty of the name of Jah his God. I believe that the Hebrew text here has the full name, but when I wrote this back in 2010, I was using Jah more so as the divine name. Either way, let's read the rest of the text. He will stand with Jah's strength. Notice, he will stand and shepherd. Who's Jesus known as? The great shepherd. And he gives illustrations about him being the shepherd. With Jah's strength and the majesty of the name of Jah his God, or Jehovah his God. They will continue to live because he will be known or become great, grow to the farthest corner of the earth. Okay, let's jump down to the Greek the translation of the Greek. These are my translations. And again, I would probably just put Jehovah there. I don't know that I've added this to the Great Message translation. This was just for this blog article. And so when I actually do the Great Message translation, I will use the form of the divine name that's in the text. Okay. Or I'll put it in brackets if it's not in the text but represents the text like I've done before. All right, back to this. So translation of the Greek text from Rolf's Septuagint copy. of Micah 5, 1 through 3. Verse 1. And you. Remember, we're reading this to show what the Jews who were keeping the law of Moses and who were worshipers of Jah, what they read and believed would eventually occur in fulfillment of the coming of the Messiah. And so Micah 5, and this is a translation essentially of the text, the earliest text that we have of Micah. Not the earliest text that there ever was, of course, because again, this is a translation of an earlier text. But it was done by a group of people who knew how to do so, and by people who as a community were skilled at translating and keeping these texts. So let's pay close attention to this because it represents more so the actual text we're going to be talking mostly about today, which is our earliest text for Micah 5. And you, Bethlehem, house of Ephrathah, you who are the smallest among the thousands of Judah, out of you will come forth the one who is to rule Israel, and whose origins, or goings forth, sayings, we'll talk about that later, are from the beginning, from ancient times, or out of days of a past age. Verse 2, because of this he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor actually does give birth. And then the remaining ones of his brothers will return, for the sons of Israel. Verse 3, and then he will stand up strong, and he will come to inspect and to shepherd his flock in the strength of Jah, and they will exist in the glory of the name of Jah their God, for he will be glorified or exalted, just like Philippians 2, 9 through 11, to the farthest corners of the earth. Now notice how similar the two accounts are. And keep in mind here, I'm using the divine name because it's clearly in the Hebrew text, but it's also in the Greek text. But I would change my 2010 translation in this blog article to the full form Jehovah. And so I will do that at some point. But either way, let's now consider the actual Greek text that you're looking at in an image there. That is known as part of the Greek Minor Prophet scroll, or the technical reference is 8 HEV XIIGR. So it's in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert series. It's not an easy to obtain series. It's not inexpensive either, but you can find it at a good seminary or theological library. Discoveries in the Judean Desert, Volume 8, Plate 6, Column 8, shows a portion of the text that we're talking about, and that I cite in this blog article that you see here. There's an image. It's not very clear, but we're going to go to the actual image in a second. And then below that is a transliteration into the Greek uncial, or capital characters. And so here, if you look, you see where my cursor is, right here in the middle of the page? This is where it says, right here, that he would stand and do shepherding in the name of Jehovah, his God. So there you can see the divine name in Paleo-Hebrew characters. There you can see the transliteration for the word God. And here again, you get more of the familiar text. And actually, so you can see that that the upper part is where it's more clear from this text down here, that he would stand and do shepherding in the name of Jehovah. And, well, it adds it in brackets, his God. So it's just not in the actual text, but it's implied. And that's what's in the Hebrew text. So that's what's more clear there. Either way, let's take a look at the clear images of what you can either refer to as 8 HEV XIIGR or Gottingen 943. There's two, what they believe is two hands, two scribes. But that's not necessarily the case. It could just be two different copies of Micah. There's some ongoing discussion about that. But either way, let's take a look at the first hand. So this is a copy of the text that we just looked at here in this transliterated form, unsealed text, and then this down here is a more modern minuscule text that is also added certain things to balance out the text. And so you can see it more clearly there in terms of the translation that I give up here. And so this is the actual text. Here's the divine name right here that I'm circling, or one form of it, one instance of it. And then let's go back here and take a look at the second hand. So I want to show you this, and you can see this on my blog article as well in your own time. So you have at your fingertips the information, the links, everything you need to document what you're seeing and what shows the evidence that we're talking about. So this is another copy of the text where you can see here the divine name used in a different form. This is actually a part of Zechariah, but it's a second hand that I wanted to reference. And so the first one is from Micah in the first hand, but this is the second hand that's a part of the collection of texts known as the Minor Prophets Scroll. But whether or not it's one scroll or more, this is still an open question. That's not what we're really concerned about here. So my main concern is to show you the hands, the texts that we're dating to this time before Jesus was born. This is what they were reading when they were reading Greek, a Greek translation of Micah 5, with the divine name right there in Paleo or ancient Hebrew. Okay, so when we refer to pre-Christian evidence, that's why I do that. I'm referring to actual texts, even if they're copies. See, I'm not using the fact that Micah actually wrote in the 8th century and saying, well, he wrote in the 8th century, and so 800 years before Jesus was born, they knew this. I could do that just because I think chronologically and based on the other evidence, that's the time when Micah likely lived and wrote. But I don't need to do that. I don't need to argue for something that's more difficult to show or prove in the same way that this can be proven and shown. And that is that they are texts that speak about things that the New Testament claims were fulfilled in Jesus, but that were written at least 75 to 175 years before he was born. And I would argue we would have to say earlier than that written-wise, because this is clearly a translation from a Hebrew or Aramaic text, hence the Paleo-Hebrew and Aramaic forms of the divine name, and as part of the collection of texts translated from earlier Aramaic and Hebrew texts. So our source material is really good, and it's good also for other texts you're going to see, like in Isaiah. When it comes to Isaiah, we have outstanding textual evidence. But let's get back to Micah. So there's a number of things here that we read. And I think as you were reading them, you probably could just associate in your mind things that are said about Jesus if you're at all familiar with the New Testament. So we know that the New Testament, describes Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, in a manger. And so that's not something people really dispute. The question is, did it really happen? And is it fulfillment of this text? Well, the fact is that this text before Jesus was born speaks of one from Bethlehem who would rule Israel, but whose origin is before, from the beginning, from ancient times. So it's talking about someone who would come forth, but who's from before he came forth. That's Jesus. There's no other figure, especially not from the time of the first century, or really in history, that we could so identify with this text that's written before he was born, well before he was born, that speaks about things that are so unique in terms of their fulfillment. You could always say someone wrote a story and had a figure be born in Bethlehem. That's true. But to then compile the story to account for this human birth that then also is so clearly tied to a pre-existence that's spoken about in texts that Jesus himself quotes, like Psalm 110:1, the Lord said to my Lord, or Jehovah said to my Lord. And Jesus tells the scribes and Pharisees that if he's David's son, why does he call him Lord? Implying he's more than David's son. And of course, Jesus openly speaks about the time when he was in heaven with the Father. John, like we're reading in 1 John, his first letter, speaks of the Word who was from the beginning. He uses these exact terms, ap arches, pretty much from the beginning. And then in John 1:1, we know he says that the Word was in the beginning with the God, as a God, as one of the sons of God, gods, that Jesus himself quotes in John 10:34 through 36 from Psalm 82 to show that he is also properly called a God like the sons of God, even more so, as he showed by quoting that text. And so the things he says and does, not just being born in a place, but this unique dual origin. Or even if you're not going to see in this text the meaning origin, like in terms of him being the firstborn, we're not going to get really caught up into a lot of different Trinitarian issues today. We might talk a little, but let's try to talk about this as evidence of Jesus as the biblical Messiah. This is for people to accept or reject, but the question is, do we have good evidence? Is this credible evidence reasonably datable to well before the events that were written, that speak about events that took place, according to the best evidence we have, in ways that aren't as simple as just telling a story about a person being born who in some way would rule a nation? There's an association here, and then a narrated story and other texts that speak, letters like Paul to Philippians, narrations like John that go into detail about the pre-existence of Jesus. Other narrations do too, when they, like I said, have Jesus quoting that text in Psalm 110:1. That's in the Synoptic Gospels, and it has Jesus showing he's more than a son of David. And then we have Jesus' own identification of himself as wisdom when he speaks of his children, and then has wisdom speaking of those same children. So the texts are pretty unanimous, just not to the same extent in their narration, about the things Jesus is said to have said and done in fulfillment of this text. And then it talks about a time that people would be given up and that his brothers would return to the sons of Israel. So there's an ongoing association with Jesus and the Jews in ways that would continue to involve the nation of Israel, as he did what? In verse 3, stood and shepherded in the strength of Jehovah, in the majesty of the name of Jehovah. So now verse 2, of course, I believe applies to the period between the time of the prophecy and the actual birth of Jesus. But nonetheless, it still has an inclusion of the people in Israel as his brothers, which I find interesting when it comes to Jesus and his association with his Jewish followers in the New Testament as his brothers. So in either case, and I'm not just saying it's a Jewish thing, because now we know it's a spiritual matter, as Paul talks about in Romans. But my point is initially that this fits that as well. Both the period between the prophecy and his actual birth, the time when she actually finishes laboring and gives birth, and the reference to the sons of Israel as his brothers. But then it says he would stand and shepherd in the strength of Jehovah and in the majesty of the name of Jehovah, his God. So I believe it's impossible for this text to have been fulfilled in Jesus if he didn't use the divine name, right? How is it possible to stand and shepherd in the strength of Jehovah and in the majesty of his name and never use that name? I believe it was later changed. The text you see here, this form here, was later changed in both the Greek translations of the Old Testament and then the New Testament, as I showed in my prior CWJah talk video on that subject. So either way, when we get back to these texts, Jesus over and over referred to his Father's name, glorifying his Father's name. He came in his Father's name, John 8:54. He quoted texts containing the divine name from his refutation of the devil and to other fulfillments of texts pertaining to Jehovah, like in Isaiah, from Isaiah. And so I don't believe there's any question that Jesus used the divine name as he fulfilled these texts, unless you're going to argue he didn't use the divine name, in which case I would argue he didn't fulfill these texts. But I believe the evidence shows he did, and that the divine name was actually redacted out of these texts. And then you notice he refers to Jehovah as his God, the text does. And over again, John 20:17, Revelation 3:4, 3:12. And in the letters of the Christians, the Father is referred to as Jesus God. Jesus is also our God in the sense that he, as the Son of God, only does what the Father does or teaches him. He's the exact representation of the Father's being. So there's no difference, like he tells Philip and others in John 14. You've seen him, you've seen the Father. That's the same with other angels who do so to the extent that Jah proves as well, which is why in the biblical texts of Genesis and others, angels are referred to as God or Jehovah, like when they appeared in the burning bush to Moses, when you compare that account with what's said in Acts. So there's nothing unusual about those associations at all, and it doesn't change the fact that Jah is still their God. No one is the God of Jah, Jehovah. But Jehovah is the God of the Messiah and all the other sons of God. That's why they're his sons, and he's their Father. So let's jump down to the Greek part of this then. And it's pretty much the same, right? When you heard me read it or read it with me, it really wasn't different at all in significant ways. And so you can see again that whether it's the Hebrew text, copies of which we have that date, to around the 9th century and 10th century, so 1,000 years more after the Greek text we have, it's the same. And then 2,000 years to today, it's the same. The reliability of the biblical text is incredible. And so you'll note here in the Greek text that we actually have the copies of that I've been showing you right here. Oh, this is actually showing a text. Well, the whole Minor Prophet scroll, I'm showing you a copy of from that scroll in both of the scripts. And then here, and that is the actual text of Micah that I had there. But it's from the collection known as the Minor Prophet scroll. So don't be confused by that. Just you'd have to use certain indicators like I do here to help find the actual text if you're going to look through these scans and try to find the actual biblical text. You'll have to look at it according to the text if you really want to make sure. So when you look at the Greek part here that I've been showing you in terms of copies there, it says the same thing, that he would come from Bethlehem, that he would rule Israel, that his origins going forth are sayings. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that would be true as well, right? Are from the beginning. So, and what do we see wisdom speaking about in Proverbs 8? The sayings of wisdom are from where? The beginning. So whether the Greek text here that today's show is not about, but that I put in the note here that it could be either goings forth, origins, or sayings, either one would be fulfilled in Jesus, whether his origins are from early times in the sense that Jesus speaks about being the firstborn Son of God, or if it's his sayings are from early times, it's the same thing because it speaks of his existence from the beginning and from which time he has sayings and can speak about things that occurred exactly like wisdom does in Proverbs 8. She talks about the things that she witnessed as Jah's child. And don't let the gender reference confuse you here. I just speak of wisdom as a she because it's how it's portrayed in the sense that the Bible personifies figures that are abstract or metaphysical, like wisdom, or even Jesus as the Word. So we're not to read into metaphysical beings' gender as much as we speak of them in reference to gender, because it's just, that's the way we talk. We personalize metaphysical beings with gender versus saying it, We say she or he based on the gender of the noun in terms of its grammatical form. So, but it's still the same being. It's just in terms of the characteristic or quality that it's embodying, wisdom or the word, the spokesman, or the aspect of God that puts things together, but that is actually a real person that just assumes that quality when speaking as wisdom. So it's the same thing. So he would be speaking, and as Proverbs does, the same saying. So there's no change in the way we could use this text to show that in both ways, either actual origin, metaphysical, firstborn of Jah, or his sayings as one who was from the beginning, like the figure of wisdom in Proverbs 8, who actually does the very thing that is said here, who speaks about things from the beginning, or at least it's spoken about here in terms of the alternate reading. And then same thing pretty much in verse 2, and the same thing as well in verse 3, including the divine name, right? Because that's the whole point of showing you this text. It's actually in the text, the Greek and the Hebrew. So when we read verse 3 in the pre-Christian text, and it says he will stand up strong, he will come to inspect and to shepherd his flock. Well, who does Jesus refer to as refer his followers as? His flock. In the strength of Jah, they will exist in the glory of the name of Jah their God. And then it says, for he will be glorified or exalted, like in Philippians 2, to the farthest corners of the earth. And that's the glory, of course, that is seen in John 12 with respect to the Messiah that Isaiah also saw. But that's not the glory that Trinitarians often mistake in Isaiah 6. I talked about that whole separate article. In fact, I wrote an Elihu online paper about that. If you want to look at my Elihu Books website and just go to the Elihu online paper section if you want more on that. But all of this is fulfilled in Jesus. Remember, this text, the one I just read right here from the Greek, is based on copies we have that date to between 75 and 175 years before Jesus was born, and which are exactly the same, basically, in terms of content, including the divine name, as the Hebrew text, Hebrew-Aramaic text from which they were translated, which obviously would have been earlier than the 75 to 175 BCE date range for the Greek text, and so closer to the 8th century when Micah actually wrote. So this information we believe is credible. This is just one in a series of texts I'm going to be presenting to everyone that many of us know, but that we can all use a good review of to further remind ourselves of the similarities that are written about in these texts concerning the Messiah as the one who would rule Israel, whose origins or sayings are from the beginning, just like we read about with Jesus in 1 John 1:1, John 1:1, and in Proverbs chapter 8, when wisdom also speaks from the beginning, as one who was there with Jah as his child, just like Jesus as his firstborn. So now the rest of this article, I go into great detail to show that, I'm going to try to just line up the whole article here for you, to show that the terms that I translate in the text mean what I translate them as they mean. Although I would adjust the form of the divine name from this 2010 article to the full form that's actually in the text we've been reviewing. But so there's different ways, as I showed in my bracketed translations, to translate some of these terms. But they all ultimately end up pointing to the same thing, and that is to Jesus as a pre-existent being whose origins are either from the beginning or whose sayings are from the beginning, and who stood in the name of Jehovah his God, or their God according to the Greek text. That's one difference. It says his text, and the Greek says it's that their text, their God. But that's the same, right? My God and your God, my Father and your Father, John 20:17. And then it says the Messiah would be glorified, just like in Philippians 2, but it would that does not change this, right? And it says he would be glorified to the farthest corners of the earth. That's what it says here as well. He would be known or grow, become great. What does it say in Philippians 2? Every knee will bow to Jesus, to the glory of God the Father. This is almost exactly what it says here, from here to here in Micah chapter 5, verse 3. So this is a very important text, not only because it shows that before Jesus was born, it was foretold that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem and that he would have these pre-existent origins or sayings, and that he would stand and shepherd people as a flock in the name of Jehovah. And as a result, because he did that, he would be glorified to the farthest extent of the earth. All of these things are written about in several different New Testament texts by different people that attest to the things, but they don't just come out in some of the great message narrations, the gospel accounts. They do quote Micah 5 as being fulfilled in Jesus, in terms of the one who would come from Bethlehem and who would rule Israel. But all of the other information in terms of him being glorified to the farthest extent of the earth, and even though that's included in some of those accounts as well, and in standing in the name of Jehovah his God, shepherding people as a flock, these are all detailed further in the rest of the New Testament letters and accounts, and in the things Jesus is said to have actually said and done. Now, if you go on through the article, I list in this article every single instance of the terms that are relevant to some of the questionable translations, questionable in the sense that it could be one or the other, origins or sayings, and other terms that I give alternates for. You can go through this whole list, or if you have questions about it now, I'm happy to entertain them. And you will see how these terms are used so that you can decide for yourself whether or not the translations and the alternates that I gave fit with the way that the terms are used in these other texts. So I encourage you to go through this, and so that you can see more how these terms can be understood, and the other references that I give from other texts that are relevant to the discussion of some parts of Micah 5 that people interpret relative to pre-existence and the naming of the Messiah. I go through all of that in this article, as you can see. It's extensive, lengthy, and I cite numerous references. Here I give a full listing and accounting of the term exodus, or exodoi in the plural, which is the Greek term used in the Greek translation of the Hebrew for goings forth, right? Exodus, going out, like the Hebrews went out of Egypt. That's the term that's used to translate the Hebrew term matza'ot in Micah 5. So, I go through that matza'ot, the verb and the noun form as well as other terms to show the meaning, ancient times, olam, and other terms that are used to convey this kind of sense of ancient or from long ago. So, and I put the notes at the end for even more information. So this article really contains, in my opinion, an extensive amount of information that I think you will find helpful when it comes to understanding and translating even, or understanding why I and others translate Micah 5, 1 and 2, and 1 through 3 actually, the way we do. And then it gives additional references. I spent a lot of time putting it together and going through all the issues. And here's a section where it shows comparatively things that are similar with Jesus and the one spoken of in Micah. Now notice this here. The note that I give, note 32 in this article, it speaks about how wisdom in Proverbs 8:35, it uses the same term, exodoi, goings out, as in Micah 5. What's said of wisdom and in Micah 5 are almost the same, and even the vocabulary that's used to express it. And so I think when you really take a good look at the different sections of the Bible that speak of the pre-existence of Jesus and foretell things about him that came true, you're going to find so many things that over such a long period of time, from texts written before Jesus to texts written after Jesus, present a consistency that just would be almost impossible to make up and maintain like that, so that we could actually go to texts dated before events that they foretell and that others write about to such an extent. We have thousands of copies. That's not something you find duplicated in really any other religion. So there's something unique about the way the Bible chronicles the history of the events related to humankind and the God Jah, and the people that Jah chose to use in ways that we believe over time were fulfilled, and why we believe that the biblical evidence in the book of Micah is credible. Why we believe it presents reliable history when it comes to the events that occurred during the time when Micah lived and wrote, and why the things that are spoken through these prophets, these well-known royal figures that served under kings of Judea, wrote about when it came to the God Jah and the things they believed he was doing after Moses brought them out of Egypt. Okay, so this isn't like Micah's just inheriting this authorship and writing about this God Jah in a vacuum. This comes from a line of people that includes Solomon, David, and Moses. So we're going back maybe, several hundred to 1,000 years to Moses. And that's not too far behind them with respect to their history and their migration from Egypt to the land of Israel, so that they would have in any way doubted their connection to that same God who brought them out of Egypt, and during which time they kept all this information, the books of Moses, the other writings, the books of Kings, then translated them so that the Greek-speaking Jews could read them. So when you put this in context and you associate it with other events like the Exodus, and then before that, of course, the flood, again, recorded in the Bible, documented and consistent with all the evidence that we can see today, that's why when we read Micah, that's associated with all these other things and the God Jah, and then it talks about a future ruler in very specific ways that we read about in relation to Jesus, but that can no longer be fulfilled because we cannot trace the origins of a Messiah as one who would be born in the line of David, and who would be born in Bethlehem in the way that it's spoken about, so that he could then stand and shepherd people in the name of Jehovah. The whole system currently existing would have to change, because they would then have to be trying to fulfill again the very things that were fulfilled already before the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. So it would not just require reconstructing the temple and following the law of Moses to the point where you could identify a Messiah who would come, according to Deuteronomy, like Moses. But you would have to have all the other associated events like we read about here in Micah 5, one whose origin or sayings is from the beginning, and who would stand and shepherd people as a flock in the name of Jehovah. They would have to start using the name again. And they're the ones who are not. And many Christians don't either. But Jesus did. I'm confident he did, because I believe that text was fulfilled in him. And I don't believe it could have been fulfilled in him. According to what it actually says, Greek and Hebrew, he would do.